Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Coates.
And I'm Tom Burgess-Wilson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters.
Coming up on the programme,
The US President Joe Biden addresses the nation, saying he accepts the choice that the country has made.
a flawed nominee or a doomed campaign. Kamala Harris promises peaceful transfer of power as the Democratic Party looks at where it all went wrong for the Vice President.
And Donald Trump holds calls with world leaders as he prepares to assemble his senior leadership team ahead of his return to the White House. Hello and welcome.
Thank you for joining us.
It's going to be another busy evening this evening, isn't it, Sarah? With
Certainly
a lot of focus on the US.
Lot of focus on the US, and we'll go there very, very shortly.
We will, and we're going to start right there. In fact, in the last half hour, President Joe Biden spoke at the White House, reaffirming his vice president's promise for a peaceful transfer of power on the 20th of January. Well, Joe Biden told the nation that the choice made by Americans, made for competing US visions, must be accepted. And his party had a responsibility to make the next 74 days count.
Yesterday, I spoke with President-elect Trump to congratulate him on his victory. And I assured him that I'd direct my entire administration to work with his team to ensure a peaceful and orderly transition.
Meanwhile, in her first address to the nation since before the election, Kamala Harris officially conceded defeat but vowed to continue advocating for the preservation of democracy and the upholding of the rule of law in the United States.
The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for, not what we voted for, but hear me when I say, the light of America's promise will always burn bright, as long as we never give up and as long as we keep fighting. In our nation, we owe loyalty not to a president or a party, but to the Constitution of the United States, and loyalty to our conscience and to our God. My allegiance to all three is why I am here to say, while I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign. This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves. This is a time to organize, to mobilize, and to stay engaged for the sake of freedom and justice and the future that we all know we can build together.
Let's now join our chief correspondent, Simon Marks, who's live from Washington, D.C. Simon, lovely to have you with us. Firstly, we have just heard from President Joe Biden. What are the main takeaways there?
Well, I think the main takeaway that he would like us all to reflect on, Sarah, is the fact that, as he emphasised for 200 years plus, the United States has always engaged in the peaceful transition from one administration to another, and January 2025 is going to be no different. He telephoned Joe Biden Donald Trump rather, to congratulate him on winning the election, and pledged to do everything that he could to assist with that transition. But there were other messages contained within the president's speech. One of them, a vigorous defence of the achievements of his own 4 years in office. He was surrounded by members of his cabinet, senior advisers and White House staffers there in the White House Rose Garden on a glorious day here as he gave that address. He also essentially said to Donald Trump, "So you like the country's electoral system when you win? He hoped, he said, that this election had proved to all Americans that they could have total faith in their election system and that there was absolutely no reason to impugn the system itself or the very hard work that had been done by staff in election offices all over the country, many of whom, the president noted, had carried out that work under significant strain, which was a tacit reference to the fact that the Republican National Committee had deployed 100,000 election integrity observers to polling stations all over the country because they thought by now, if Kamala Harris was on the brink of a narrow win in the election, they might be mired in litigation complaining about the conduct of the election. Donald Trump, having won the election, not quite on election night, but in the early hours of the following morning, Joe Biden was essentially tweaking him and saying, so you like it when you win. And he actually said in those remarks, President Biden, you can't only love your country when you win. And Democrats, he inferred, are going to prove that you can love it when you lose.
Okay, so very much an exercise in dialing down the sort of the temperature there in the United States. How would you describe the overall mood in Washington and in the US at this moment?
Yeah, Tom, I mean, I think it's important to say that President Biden was dialing the temperature down. I think Kamala Harris walked a slightly different line yesterday, saying to Democrats, don't despair. You have to tolerate this. There's going to be a smooth transition of power, but prepare to mobilize and to fight for America's democracy. I mean, those were the words that she used yesterday at Howard University, and there was definitely a call to action contained within Kamala Harris's address that we didn't hear so much from President Biden. I mean, the mood in this town is redolent of the fact that thousands of people here are now fearful for their jobs, particularly career civil servants who know that Donald Trump has spoken about firing all of them and bringing only Make America Great Again loyalists into their positions. This, as you know, Washington, D.C. is a Democratic Party stronghold. And I can tell you, just purely one example. I took the bus home last night from our office downtown up to the northern suburbs, and I had two people on either side of me, both of them on the phones, two loved ones. They both worked, one for a non-governmental organization, another for, in some fashion, the Harris campaign. And they were both saying to loved ones, they think it's time they've got to get out of here. One saying that she and her husband were abandoning plans to buy property here, abandoning plans to start a family here, even thinking that they might have to move to another country, and the other woman trying to determine in which Democrat strongholds that are left she ought to be circulating her curriculum vitae in order to start looking for another job. So there is definite despondency here among Democrats, and that's reflective of the fact that this is a Democratic Party stronghold, and the Republicans under Donald Trump are about to ride into town.
Always appreciate your time. Simon Marks in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Well, for more reaction, we can speak now to the former White House Director of Speechwriting to President Bill Clinton. David Kusnet, great to have you back with us here on Arabiya News. Thank you for taking the time. 74 days to go now until the transition of power. And as we were just saying, we've heard Joe Biden speaking and striking a conciliatory note. It sounds like he's trying to dial down the temperature. Just want to ask you first up, what stood out for you in what President Biden said?
Well, I think he's made a point that he's been making since day one of his administration, and even before that during the transition and the aftermath of his victory in 2020, which is, as he often says, you can't love your country only when you win. He was elected in 2020 saying that he would defend the soul of America and defend the democratic process. And that's what he kept saying, and I think kept doing during his administration. And that's what he's saying now as the transition begins away from the Biden administration and back to another Trump administration.
President Biden also said that Harris should be proud of her campaign. In your opinion, should she be?
I think she should be. She had a very brief campaign. I think, I may be wrong, I think it was about 100 days, or, roughly the length that the transition will be, roughly the length that national campaigns are in countries other than the United States. But for the United States, that was almost like a pop-up or a startup. She had to hit the ground running and come in as the nominee very hastily after President Biden decided not to run, and just run nonstop from the moment when he handed the baton to her to election night. And I think she did that without faltering, without falling down, without any serious misstep, and without saying or doing anything that will disgrace her morally or patriotically in the years to come.
I mean, it was a pretty conclusive victory for Donald Trump in this election. And, obviously went against what the pollsters had predicted in many cases. Presumably now there's going to be a post-mortem in the ranks of the Democratic Party, and they're going to be asking the question, where did it all go wrong? In your opinion, where did it go wrong?
Well, this has been a bad year for incumbents around the world. And anyone who took office in 2021, as Joe Biden and Kamala Harris did, was coming in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, in the midst of the economic crisis that followed from the pandemic, the very high unemployment, terrible costs on the economy, and broken down supply chains. And also in this country, in the midst of a political crisis, because while President Biden and Vice President Harris have been very gracious about conceding defeat, Donald Trump did not ever concede defeat in 2020, did not do anything to cooperate with the transition, and incited an insurrection on January 6th, 2021. So that this administration came in the midst of a medical crisis, an economic crisis, and a political crisis. And it's understandable that there was probably not a moment during the 4 years when they served when most Americans were unequivocally believing that the country was on the right track, or happy about the economic status quo, or willing to give their leaders the benefit of a doubt.
So taking that into account, where to now for the Democrats? What can we actually assume is happening behind closed doors? How do they recover from something like this?
Well, I at least think that they need to be an opposition that is loyal to the small d democratic process and loyal to the Constitution, but that opposes Donald Trump whenever and wherever they need to oppose him. And I think in particular, they need to prevent him from posing as some kind of a populist who has the interests of working Americans at heart, because he doesn't. He didn't when he was president, he didn't during the campaign. And there's absolutely no reason to believe that he will do that in a second term. You have Elon Musk, who seems to be one of the gray eminences, not so gray, but one of the eminences behind a 78-year-old Donald Trump, promising people pain in the kind of economic transition that Elon Musk wants to have, and and the authors of the Project 2025 Heritage Foundation want to have. And I think the Democrats from day one need to defend working Americans against those who want to impose pain on them. And they need to defend the democratic process against those who want to replace democracy with autocracy. So I think the highest loyalty as an opposition is to be loyal to the American political system and to be loyal to the great majority of Americans.
David, let's talk a bit about communications and speechwriting, since that's your area of expertise. Now, in an article in the New York Times back in July, you analysed Joe Biden's speech delivery, and you were slightly scathing of it. And I'm just wondering whether you would have advised Kamala Harris to perhaps change something about the way she gave speeches. What are your thoughts?
Well, I hope I was sympathetic rather than scathing toward President Biden. he's 80 years old, and no 80-year-old speaks the same way they did when they were 40 years old. And he's someone whom the American people literally saw grow up from being the youngest senator, one of the youngest senators in history in 1973 to being one of the oldest presidents in history by 2020. Vice President Harris's speaking style is just naturally very different. So there would be no need to advise her to speak differently from President Biden, because she does speak differently from President Biden. I think the challenge for her is that it's always been difficult for a vice president, a sitting vice president, to run for president. And with the exception of George H.W. Bush in 1988, their one lost record has not been terribly good in recent memory. Richard Nixon lost in 1960. Hubert Humphrey lost in 1968. Walter Mondale, 4 years after leaving vice president, and I worked for him in 1984, he lost in 1984. Al Gore lost in the year 2000. So it's always been difficult to go from being a loyal understudy to go towards being someone who's coming forward in their own right and speaking authoritatively. And that's always a challenge. And Vice President Harris had the added challenge of having to transition in those roles within one tumultuous day, and then have a very short sprint from President Biden passing the baton to her to the election day.
I'd like to bring up the argument that we heard from CNN's Scott Jennings. He said that Kamala Harris had big-name celebrities, but these gimmicks were misleading and gave people false hope that Harris was going to win the election. What do you make of that argument?
I didn't watch Scott Jennings on CNN, so I'm not sure exactly what he said. I don't know anyone who thought that Kamala Harris was going to win because she had celebrity support. But it is, I think, a bit ironic to say that Kamala Harris is running as a celebrity candidate when, in fact, Donald Trump was able to run for president in 2016, not because he had any record in public service and not because he was a terribly successful businessman who had inherited a fortune from his father and really did not grow that fortune in any way, but because he himself was a celebrity from The Apprentice, where he played a much more successful businessman than he had actually been.
And of course, we reported it on Arabiya News that Kamala Harris didn't actually get the endorsements of a couple of major newspapers. And you know, we tend to think of the media as being fairly friendly to the Democrats in the United States, and yet she didn't get those endorsements. Do you think perhaps there were people in the media who just weren't convinced by her as a candidate?
Well, I think they also were under pressure from Donald Trump and his supporters at the rallies, who cheered whenever he promised not just to inflict some kind of financial retribution on the newspapers, but to inflict physical violence on the reporters covering his events. I think there was probably some degree of intimidation going on. It's interesting, while there were well-known newspapers that did not support Vice President Harris, there were very few newspapers that supported Donald Trump.
Trump's communication style seems to have struck a real chord. Do you believe it was the message or the messenger, or potentially both?
Well, I gave a talk once to a professional conference of speechwriters. I think this was about, it seems more recent, but I think it was about 20 years ago, where I said that authenticity is the new eloquence. And Donald Trump does seem authentic because he talks in public the way a lot of people talk in private. The downside to that is a lot of people talk in private in ways that they wouldn't be proud if people were listening to them in public. And I think Trump has both the advantage and the disadvantage of a kind of authenticity where he says whatever comes into his head, a lot of which is not the way most presidents the way any president before him has sounded. I think there are presidents who, when their private conversations are transcribed or leaked, they have said things like what Donald Trump says at nationally televised rallies, but those presidents in the past were embarrassed, not proud of the kinds of things that they said in private.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a lot has changed in terms of the communication style since when you were writing speeches in the White House for Bill Clinton. I mean, do you think Donald Trump, from what you were just saying there, has really rewritten, to a certain extent, some of the rules of the game?
I think he has. A lot of some of the most politically successful presidents have been the first ones to make an impact on what were then new media. Franklin D. Roosevelt gave the fireside chats, and he's really the first president who used television well. John F. Kennedy, or used radio well, I'm sorry, used radio well. John F. Kennedy was the first president who was really good on television. Ronald Reagan, I think, took Kennedy's gift for television and carried it further. Bill Clinton, who I worked for, was really the first president of what was then the 24-hour cable news cycle. And he was also the first president to go successfully on entertainment programs, like playing the saxophone on what was then Arsenio Hall's television show. I think Barack Obama was the first president of sort of the fully online era, someone whose speeches were streamed online and who got pushed the message out not only in real-time coverage, but through offerings online. And I think Donald Trump really is the first president of what may be remembered as the Twitter era. And it's probably no accident that he's supported by the billionaire who bought Twitter and converted it into a more partisan platform as X. And he's also, I think, Donald Trump is the first president who's been on a lot of podcasts. So a lot of presidents have been the first to really make use of what were new media in their own times.
Absolutely. You raised some really good points there, but we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. David Kusnet, former White House Director of Speechwriting for President Bill Clinton. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you.
To the situation in the Middle East now, with deadly airstrikes carried out in Lebanon and also protests in Israel following the shock firing of Israel's defense minister. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sacked Yoav Gallant on Tuesday, just as the world was tuning in to the American election, with a lack of trust between the Premier and the popular minister given as the reason.
Well, let's listen now to Benjamin Netanyahu explaining the decision to fire the defense minister, who had opposed the prime minister's approach to ceasefire talks and the objective of the over-year-long war in Gaza.
בעיצומה של מלחמה, יותר מתמיד.
In the midst of a war, more than ever, full trust is required between the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense. Unfortunately, although in the first months of the war there was such trust and there was very fruitful work, during the last months this trust cracked. Significant gaps were discovered between me and the Minister of Defense Gallant in the management of the campaign, and these gaps were accompanied by statements and actions that contradict the decision of the government and the decisions of the cabinet. I made many attempts to bridge these gaps, but they kept getting wider. They also came to the knowledge of the public in an unacceptable way, and worse than that, they came to the knowledge of the enemy. Our enemies enjoyed it and derived a lot of benefit from it.
With Foreign Minister Israel Katz, a longtime ally of Netanyahu, chosen to take over. Gallant, in a video statement, explains the so-called disagreements between him and the Premier.
This dismissal comes as a result of disagreements over three issues. The first, my decisive position that everyone who is of draft age must be drafted, must serve in the IDF, and defend the State of Israel. We must not allow a discriminatory and corrupt law to pass in the Israeli Knesset and exempt thousands of citizens from carrying the burden. It is time for a change.
Yoav Gallant speaking there. Well, Israeli citizens have been taking to the streets in scenes reminiscent of the time that Benjamin Netanyahu was forced to walk back the firing of Gallant back in 2023. We can cross now to our correspondent Giles Gibson, who's standing by for us in Tel Aviv. Giles, welcome to the program. Just talk us through the situation on the ground right now. How are people reacting to all of this?
Well, this evening, we've not really seen any sign of any major protests against this decision by Benjamin Netanyahu to fire his Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. But on Wednesday, we had some very significant protests, thousands of people coming out onto the streets in cities all over Israel, and in particular outside the Knesset, the country's parliament in Jerusalem, demanding that Benjamin Netanyahu reverse this decision to fire Yoav Gallant. That decision set to take effect really any minute now due to legal processes here in Israel. Really, even before the decision took effect, there was very little or basically zero chance that Benjamin Netanyahu was going to change his mind on this, as he has done, you indicated before, just because of the crisis of trust that he described when he announced this decision to fire his defense minister, and also some of the barbs that have been fired back by Yoav Gallant since this announcement was first made public. Look, we have certainly seen thousands or even tens of thousands of people coming out onto the streets, similar scenes to what we saw back in March of 2023, the last time that Benjamin Netanyahu tried to fire Yoav Gallant. But at this stage, it doesn't look like they've quite reached the numbers, the intensity that we saw, about a year and a half ago.
And Giles, moving on, and reports are coming in with regards to another incident in Lebanon involving UNIFIL peacekeepers. What more can you tell us there?
Yeah, we've had a pretty brief statement from the United Nations, from UNIFIL, saying that there was a convoy of newly arrived peacekeepers moving its way through southern Lebanon, and that there was a drone strike nearby, that leading to 5 of those newly arrived peacekeepers being injured lightly, although they have now been able to proceed on to take up their duties. We also have had some comments from the Lebanese military saying that Israel hit a car that was moving through a checkpoint in the area, and that 3 civilians inside that vehicle were killed in that strike. I thought it was interesting that the UN statement doesn't actually name Israel by name. It simply talks about that drone strike that I mentioned, but it does call for all actors in the region to really sort of avoid any sort of escalation, any sort of loss of life or injuries to its peacekeepers. And we've also heard from the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, saying simply that they are looking into these reports.
All right, Giles Gibson in Tel Aviv, thank you very much indeed for bringing us all the latest on that.
Right, let's stay on all of these developments in the Middle East. And for more, I'm joined by the former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel, now a senior fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, Professor Chuck Freilich. Thank you very much for your time. Firstly, I would really like to get your take on Benjamin Netanyahu's sacking of the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. He was someone, of course, that did have quite a lot of military experience. In your opinion, did Netanyahu make the right call here?
No, I think he made a very mistaken call. Gallant was the probably most prominent minister in the cabinet, and one who displayed the most responsibility throughout the course of the war. Now, he's also one of the people, along with the prime minister, who bear ministerial responsibility for the catastrophic failure of October 7th. But his firing, to be frank, wasn't really about significant policy differences between the two of them, substantive differences. It was really about the fact that Gallant, Netanyahu's coalition was literally coming apart on Sunday and Monday of this week. And had he not fired Gallant, who was opposing the move now to extend the exemption that the ultra-Orthodox have in Israel from military service, the coalition would have come apart. So this was really simply about coalition politics and Netanyahu doing whatever was necessary to preserve his coalition for as long as possible.
Let's talk about Gallant's replacement, Israel Katz, who has been serving as foreign minister in his place. He doesn't have anything like the level of experience when it comes to military matters that Gallant has. And I just wonder how you see that playing out, given that Israel is fighting on a couple of different fronts.
Well, I think this was an irresponsible decision to replace a guy like Gallant at this time. You don't have to have a significant military background to be defense minister. There have been a couple in the past who did not have that kind of a background and who proved to be successful defense ministers. But to do so in the middle of the war, and as you're saying, to replace him with someone, Katz has been around for a while, so it's not that he's clueless. But to replace him in the middle of the war with someone like Katz is, I believe, another example of Netanyahu doing things with very little regard for the interests of the state of Israel and a great deal of regard for his own coalition considerations.
And Professor, Benjamin Netanyahu has been accused by quite a lot of people of torpedoing a deal to get these remaining Israeli hostages back. He's basically been saying that military pressure alone can do this. In your opinion, how do these people come home? What needs to happen?
Well, first of all, Hamas has to be willing to reach a deal. And whatever suspicions there are regarding Netanyahu's role in this, first of all, we have to see that Hamas is willing. And I think there's considerable question whether they actually ever have truly been willing. And I'm putting aside rhetoric, whether they ever really were truly willing to reach a deal. Then there's a question whether Netanyahu really wants a deal or not. I mean, if he could get the hostages back without paying much of a price, then I think he would be happy to do it. But if the Hamas condition remains an absolute end to the war, that may conflict with Netanyahu's interest in perpetuating the conflict, at least for a good while, again, for his own political consideration.
And just on that, if there is no change in the position of Benjamin Netanyahu, no change in the position of Hamas, if they are not willing to budge, what happens then?
Well, I think the conclusion is implicit in your question, and I don't want to say more than that.
And just lastly, I mean, we understand that Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump have now spoken. We're being told that the conversation between the two men was friendly. I just wonder whether you could tell us how you see events panning out during the next couple of months and what it changes having Donald Trump heading back to the White House.
Well, first of all, there are still 2.5 months to the Biden administration. And in the Middle East, that's eternity. So a lot can still happen during Biden's watch. But there will certainly be contacts between the Israeli government and the transition team. This, of course, has to be done subject to the limitations of American law, but discussing current events, future events, and how the two sides might address them, I think we'll probably see pretty extensive consultations in this time. There's a lot of speculation about the close cooperation that we can expect between Netanyahu and Trump. And in some areas, I think that's probably true. But in some areas, maybe not. And there's a potential for considerable disagreement. And whereas Netanyahu could allow himself to disagree even publicly and sometimes significantly with Biden because he was assured of his friendship or his friendship for Israel, essentially no matter what, I'm not sure that he can make that assumption in regard to Trump.
Professor Freilich, we really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much. Looking now at Donald Trump's favourite word when it comes to economy and trade, tariffs.
I'm doing the same thing with China. We're going to tariff the hell out of them. We're going to put tariffs, and I even said we'll put 100, 200, I don't care what the number is. And the president has the right to impose the tariffs on these countries that have been hurting us. They've really been hurting us. It's so ridiculous. We killed that plant just by the threat of tariffs. I'm telling you, outside of love and religion, it's the most beautiful word there is. Tariff!
President-elect Donald Trump speaking there. Well, he's promised to add anywhere between a 10 and 20% tariff on imports and even higher tariffs on goods from China.
Now, while this may encourage investors to operate out of the US, some businesses are worried about its wider impact. As uncertainty around the proposal swirls, some consumers are wondering whether they will pay the cost of Trump's policy shift.
Well, for more, I'm joined now by the former US trade representative under President Donald Trump, Stephen Vaughn. Stephen, great to have you with us. Thank you very much for taking the time. We heard from President Joe Biden in the last hour or so. He says he's leaving the US economy in good shape. Just a first question to you. Do you agree with that? Is he leaving the US economy in good shape?
Well, I think the voters had their say on Tuesday, and they did not agree. Real wages really haven't been very strong over the last few years. We've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs this year. The real median household incomes have been stagnant over the last 4 years. So I don't think the voters agreed with that, and I think that's why President Trump is getting a chance to take us in a different direction.
Wall Street seems to have responded favourably to the prospect of another Trump presidency. What do you read into that?
Well, I think that, I think people are optimistic that we're going to see the type of performance that we saw the last time President Trump was in there. We saw a tremendous run-up in the stock market, especially during the first 3 years of the administration. But even after the COVID crisis, if you look at where the markets were in 2021, when President Trump left office the first time, they were up dramatically from when he took over. I think people are anticipating that. I think they expect tax reform, regulatory reform, and a strong and robust trade policy that should all lead to stronger jobs and employment here in the United States.
So do you think the positive momentum on Wall Street is going to continue for some time then?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to try to, speculate on what the markets are going to do, but I do think the conventional wisdom here is that the economic program that he had the first term was quite successful. He's promised to do a continuation of that, and I think people expect similar results.
Yeah, and obviously, if the Republicans have got control of both houses of Congress, that does give President Trump, doesn't it, the freedom to enact sweeping policy changes of this nature.
Well, it makes a huge difference, obviously, but remember that the U.S. system, the Congress, is not like a parliament, right? He doesn't have the sort of control over the Congress that, say, a prime minister of the U.K. would have. But obviously, it is better when you have your party in charge of both houses of Congress. He was able to get the tax cuts approved in 2017. He was able to get his big trade deal with Canada and Mexico approved by Congress, even when the Democrats held the House. So he's had good success in working with Congress, and I would expect that will happen again.
And economists have been warning that Trump's proposals, that they would come as a shock to countries around the world, including the Eurozone and the UK economy. Surely he can't deny the need for free and open global trade.
Well, I think that if you look at the record for the last several decades, the U.S. has consistently run very, very significant trade deficits with many of our biggest trading partners, and certainly with the world as a whole. That is an unbalanced economy. We aren't just consumers here in the United States. We produce things, we make things. We would like to be able to sell more of our goods in the open market. And I think it's not really right or fair to expect the Americans to basically always be in a deficit position relative to the rest of the world. I think that's what President Trump is concerned about, and I think that's what a lot of voters are concerned about.
Let's just talk lastly about President Trump's election pledge to impose taxes of 10 to 20% on all foreign goods. I mean, do you think we're looking here at the beginnings of a global trade war?
Well, I think a lot of that's going to depend on sort of, what happens here and also what happens around the world. Like I said, to me, the most striking fact about global trade over the last 40, 50 years is that the United States has consistently run these very, very large trade deficits. Even as we lost manufacturing capacity, we lost a lot of our auto industry, we lost a lot of our steel jobs. I mean, it's been a very negative situation for us. And I think the Americans are basically saying to the world, we want all this to be more rebalanced. We're not necessarily saying we want less trade, but we need to be able to sell more in the open market. We're not consumers only, we're also producers.
All right, well, thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. Stephen Vaughn, former US Trade Representative under President Donald Trump. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us.
Well, as we mentioned earlier in the program, Joe Biden has congratulated incoming President Trump on the phone, inviting him to a meeting at the White House. Well, Donald Trump will enter the Oval Office following his inauguration in January as the United States returns to a Republican regime. So, what could it look like?
Well, to answer that question and more, we're joined now by the deputy editor of The Spectator and the host of the Americano podcast, Freddie Gray. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Freddie, I gather you've just come back from the United States and you were in that room in Florida for Trump's victory speech. And I just wondered what the atmosphere was like in the room that night.
Well, it was extraordinary elation, really. I've been comparing it to a sort of a football match when, a team scores an absolutely thrilling winner in the last minute. When Pennsylvania sort of finally came in, which really just sort of sealed it, the crowd went absolutely crazy. And it was hard not to be quite touched by it. I mean, people were sort of crying and hugging each other. I'm sure a lot of people have grave doubts about Trump and Trumpism. But Trump voters are pretty normal, nice people. And they were just having a great time.
And Freddie, you've suggested that this could be a different President Trump from 2016. You've described him as an American titan and the most extraordinary politician of our time. What can we expect from Trump 2.0?
Well, I think inside Trump world, there's a lot of talk, and we have to wait and see how real this talk is. But there certainly has been a lot more preparation and apparent professionalism, first in the campaign, but also in thinking about transition. I think when Donald Trump won in 2016, it's often said, I'm not quite sure how true it is, but it's often said that he wasn't expecting to, and he didn't even really want to win. I don't think the latter part is true. But it's certainly true that they were completely unprepared. And Donald Trump thought that he could work with Washington. He thought that because he'd won the election, he would have a mandate and that the institutions of government would work with him. And everybody inside Trump world feels that the institutions of government works very strongly against them. And I think now there are two things that are more likely to happen than happened in 2016. One is that the institutions of government cannot dismiss him anymore as a kind of freakish aberration, as his victory as a freak result. He's done it now. He very nearly did it in 2020 again. He's done it now in a more decisive way in 2024. And the other thing is that Trump people are determined to make sure that their agenda is implemented. And there's going to be two very controversial areas, well, three if you include Ukraine, but two very controversial domestic subjects here. One will be immigration. And the Trump administration has committed to deporting up to over a million possibly, undocumented migrants from America. That's going to be a very, very brutal and difficult policy to implement, and it's going to face huge backlash. The other policy is going to be on justice. The people within Trump world are very, very angry about the way Donald Trump was targeted legally. And I think, we can say objectively that it was a persecution of sorts. They were looking for they were trying to find the guilt on the man rather than finding the crime. And so there may be some dramatic attempts to reform the Department of Justice and to actually go after the people who went after Donald Trump. There's some division now in Trump world about that. Steve Bannon has been making very threatening comments, but the Trump team, Corey Lewandowski, one of his long-term advisors, has been quick to say Steve Bannon doesn't speak for us. And, you know, we're trying to be a unity party. But on the 26th of November, Judge Merchant in New York will make a ruling and possibly sentence Donald Trump over the falsification of business records case in New York. If he does that, I think we'll see a really, really angry reaction from within Trump world. And you will then see, when Trump does come into power, you will see some quite dramatic moves on the Department of Justice. But I think the Democrats are being sensible enough, certainly Special Counsel Jack Smith and the other federal cases, they're being sensible enough to think, let's wind this down, partly because they're quite worried about what might happen after January 20th, when he gets into power, when he has not just the Department of Justice, but the Senate and also the House of Representatives.
Freddie, we heard from President Joe Biden a little earlier on tonight, this evening, and you have said, I think, that he'll go down in history as a failed one-term president. But you've also said he is, after all, the only Democrat who has ever managed to beat Trump. What do you think's next for Joe Biden and his party?
Well, I think, I mean, I don't want to be unkind, but I think Joe Biden is very old, and I think retirement is overdue. I think a lot of people feel that, and even within his family. As for the Democrats, it's a very interesting question. I spoke to some Democrats in Washington this week, and they were of the view that if they lose, it's time for a real rethink about the party, because they feel that, they didn't say it as directly as this, but they feel that for 4 years, they essentially pretended that Joe Biden was kind of okay and firing all cylinders when the whole world could see he wasn't. And then they they elevated Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, even though I know she was on the ticket, but nobody really voted for Kamala Harris in Democratic primaries. She never would have won the primaries all by herself. So they effectively behaved in an anti-democratic manner. And if you're called a Democratic Party, you need to behave in a more democratic manner. I think there are some quite sensible Democrats in the party, people like Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, who are thinking about how the Democratic Party can reset so that it can win again by 2028. It'll be very difficult for them. They have lots of tensions and divisions. On foreign policy, they're particularly split over Gaza. Their base is very pro-Palestine, whereas the top of the party is very pro-Israel, and a lot of the donors are very pro-Israel. So that's going to tear the party apart for some time to come. But I think there will be a period of soul-searching now among Democrats. And I think it's probably time, although I think people have been saying this for a long time, but it's probably time for sort of Nancy Pelosi, obviously Joe Biden, perhaps even Barack Obama. It's probably time for them to sort of move aside and let the next generation come up and be the leaders of the Democratic Party.
OK, Freddie Gray from The Spectator, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Now, following Donald Trump's election win, Tehran says it doesn't expect a fundamental change in relations, but some fear Trump's second term could further deepen the rift between the US and Iran. Now, Trump's hardline policies during his previous term, including the withdrawal from the nuclear deal and targeted sanctions, significantly strained relations and impacted Iran's economy.
Well, with Trump back in office, Iranian officials have signaled that they are prepared to confront any perceived threats more forcefully, potentially ramping up their nuclear program or increasing influence in the region. And that's raising concerns in both Washington and amongst US allies.
For more, we're joined by Seyed Hossein Mousavian, the former Iranian ambassador to Germany and former senior negotiator for Iran on the nuclear issue. Thank you so very much for your time this evening. Some months back, you said that a second Trump term presidency would be a boost to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. Tell me why.
Of course, in Iran also there is such a narrative that President Trump would follow the mandate and the initiatives of Prime Minister Netanyahu, like what he did in his first term. However, I don't believe so that President Trump would be the same as his first term, because during his campaign, he publicly said his main objective is to end the wars in the Middle East. If this is the case, I mean, if President Trump is going practically to go forward to end the wars in the Middle East, we have war on Gaza, we have war on Lebanon, and we have military conflict between between Israel and Iran. To end the war on Gaza, it is clear the solution is an immediate ceasefire, evacuation of Israeli troops from Palestinian territory, exchange of hostages, and ultimately the return of 2.3 million displaced people and reconstruction of Gaza. And on Lebanon war, if there is going to be any solution to end the war in Israeli war on Lebanon, the solution also is very clear. This is implementation of Resolution 1701. Whether President Trump's practical policies would be focused on these type of solutions, I'm sure he would be able to end those wars. And definitely this would prepare a good ground to end Iranian and Israeli military conflict. At the end, if President Trump is going to have a sustainable deal with Iran, he needs to take serious initiative to end the military confrontation, mutual confrontation between Iranian and Israelis in order to help peace and stability in the region.
Just talking more specifically about Iran and what Iran does next, given that Donald Trump is heading back to the White House, I just want to get your opinion on whether you think Iran is likely to go ahead with another reprisal attack for the reprisal attack that Israel carried out on Iran on the 26th of October, or do you think perhaps Iran will decide to hold back given developments in Washington?
Iranian officials, they publicly, they have said that they definitely would retaliate, they would reciprocate, but they may wait a little bit. They may do not hurry to attack Israel because they may wait for a little bit to see what would be the American policy. If the U.S. would take serious steps to end the war on Gaza, the war on Lebanon, I think that would really help for Iran to restrain. But if Israelis are going to escalate the war on Gaza, the war on West Bank, the war on Lebanon, this really would not be helpful, and maybe this would encourage Iran to retaliate. Nevertheless, in Iran, we have two schools of thoughts. One, from the beginning of revolution, one school of thoughts, always they have been insisting that there is no difference between Democrats and Republicans. American policy is regime change in Iran. American policy is to disintegrate Iran. American policy is to isolate Iran. Therefore, there is no need for negotiation. You cannot trust the U.S. Even if you agree with the U.S., they will cheat, and so and so. There is another school of thought that they say, despite of all these issues, it is good to be engaged. It is good to start negotiation, even directly. It is good to try for a deal like the Iranian nuclear deal. Currently, fortunately, in Tehran, we have an administration which is pro-engagement. President Pezeshkian has publicly said he is ready for a new nuclear deal. He is ready to de-escalate tension with the U.S. He is ready to de-escalate tension with the regional countries. He is ready to de-escalate tension with Europe. Even he is ready to join FATF, which is extremely important on the money laundering and so. Then we have to wait to see what would be President Trump's practical policies on Iran. I think President Trump, during his campaign, he made two very constructive and positive statements. He said he is not after regime change in Iran. This is very important. For Iranians, this is very important to be sure that the U.S. is going to give up the regime change policy. And the second, he said he just want no nuclear deal, no nuclear bomb in Iran. If this is the two main objectives of President Trump, since we have a moderate administration in Iran, I believe he would have a good chance to make a new deal with Iran, because a new deal with Iran based on Iran not to have nuclear weapon, it is really achievable, because you can agree on four major principles. The first one would be the full non-discriminatory implementation of Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. The second would be full transparency and full verification of Iranian nuclear program. And the third would be practically lifting the sanctions from the US side and the world powers. Ultimately, the sustainable solution for whole Middle East would be nuclear weapon-free zone and WMD-free zone. Here, it is Iran has voted to all UN resolutions. Iran has been supporting nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East for 50, 60 years, and we have Iranian Supreme Leader religious fatwa on prohibition of nuclear weapons and all weapons of mass destruction. Another element of a new deal could be operationalizing the Supreme Leader's fatwa for assurances of no nuclear or WMD weapons in Iran and in the region and in the Middle East.
With regards to this tit-for-tat that we've been seeing between Israel and Iran, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, he has been saying that Israel has greater freedom of action than ever before. He said we can go anywhere that we need to in Iran. Now tell me, does this sense of confidence stem from the fact that Israel perhaps infiltrated Iran like never before? What's your take on that?
You have heard Israelis are also saying that Iran has infiltrated Israel. Even an Israeli minister has been spying for Iran. They have arrested many spies inside Israel for Iranians. Infiltration has been practically done between both sides during last decade. This is a mutual concern. This is a mutual grievances, and even this is a mutual claims. They both are saying that we have open hand, free hand to infiltrate or to have access to anywhere. Iranians also, they are saying the same. But however, ultimately, if you're going to have a peace in the region, if you're going to de-escalate the tensions in the region, if you're going to have a type of new deal between Iran and the US should take serious steps to contain the current mutual conflict and military confrontation between Iran and Israel, because this is not really neither in the interest of Iran, nor Israel, nor US, and even the region.
Seyed Hossein Mousavian, the former Iranian ambassador to Germany and former senior negotiator, we really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, with Donald Trump's return to the White House, China is back to being a central focus. Well, during his campaign, Trump suggested ways to manage America's relationship with China when it comes to manufacturing. Well, a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry has expressed hopes for a, quote, peaceful coexistence between the two countries.
For more, let's speak to former Chinese diplomat and current vice president of the Center for China and Globalization, Victor Gao. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Firstly, what is your reaction to Donald Trump's election victory?
First of all, the Chinese government has already congratulated Donald Trump on his election as the next president of the United States. Chinese President Xi Jinping already sent his personal greeting to him for his re-election. So I think China is well positioned to deal with the incoming Trump administration 2.0 in a very serious and constructive manner. Now, President Trump has made many announcements on what he will do about China, maximizing tariffs, etc. I think China need to deal with this in a very earnest manner. I think China will need to stand firm to defend matters of principle, but achieve maximum flexibility in terms of, for example, how to make the bilateral trade more sustainable in the coming 4 years beyond. And maximum flexibility for both China and the United States will be very much needed in dealing with the whole multitude of issues between these two largest economies in the world.
Okay, I wanted to ask you a bit more about that. So let's imagine a scenario in which Donald Trump comes good on that promise. He imposes tariffs of 60%, for example, on certain Chinese imports. What options has China got by way of methods to respond to that?
First of all, Mr. Donald Trump, the president-elect.
I'm not sure if you're still with us. Seems we may have lost the line there with Victor Gao. See if we can get it back. Just talking there about that question of tariffs. Donald Trump's favorite word, he says.
Favorite word?
Yeah, indeed. And we wanted to find out there what China might do to respond if indeed Donald Trump does impose those 60% tariffs on Chinese imports. That would be quite
Certainly.
dramatic.
Will be very, very interesting. It will be good to get Victor back to discuss that a little bit more.
Absolutely. We'll hopefully get him back very shortly. No, there's obviously a trade war is something that we were talking right at the top of the show about as well, the possibility that Donald Trump, with his measures like tariffs that he wants to impose on countries that he views as being hostile to the US economy, and he thinks the playing field isn't level, he obviously wants to consider things like tariffs to correct that. Okay, well, let's take a listen now to what the US president is saying. The US president-elect, Donald Trump. Let's take a listen to what is actually being said at this particular moment. Oh, sorry, it's Vladimir Putin. The Russian president is speaking. Let's take a listen to what he's saying.
Information, unfortunately, this does happen, but I would like to reiterate, if the internet complies with domestic legislation, then this will allow us to minimize potential negative consequences. I do understand the technological difficulties and restrictions. It's going to be a tall order, but if we choose this path of engaging with the professional community that sees where the threats might be coming from for society, then it's going to be a way for the professional community to address those threats on its own. But of course the government should be willing to lend a helping hand. For such countries as Russia and India, this is a task that can be addressed. We have very good, top-notch specialists and experts. We've got very good schools of mathematics. We've got people who have proven to be leaders in this field. Well, even if their companies are not yet leaders, they themselves, as experts, have raised to prominence in the field. So we've got everything we need, especially in such countries as India and Russia. Now, as for the mere payment system that you have mentioned, to an extent, it's been a success, it's working, it's functioning. It could function even better, and it could be expanded if there had been no artificial barriers put in the way. But even though these barriers are being built, mere payment system is developing, and we're going to replicate this success. The issue of the internet, it has become a permanent fixture of our discussions. You said that the internet was created as a public good to serve the benefit of humanity. Well, of course, it was built for other purposes in the very beginning, but at a certain point in time, its goals changed. And if we've got to make sure that our activities in the internet, just as any other type of human activity, should be in compliance with moral and legal requirements. Of course, technologically, it's not always easily achievable, but it can be done. Society has to protect itself against destructive influence. But at the same time, we've got to ensure free exchange of information, and we also have to make sure that it benefits the development of countries and the international community at large. And we in Russia are going to pursue this path. I know India follows suit, and we're going to...
Okay, we were just listening in there to the Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking at the Valday Discussion Club in the Black Sea resort of Sochi. He's been talking there, amongst other things, about efforts to end the war in Ukraine. He said, do not pressure us, do not pressure Russia into negotiations on Ukraine. Very interesting in the context of the incoming president-elect Donald Trump in the United States. Let's go back to Victor Gao, a Chinese diplomat who joined us there, and we just lost the line very briefly while we were talking to you. I just put the question to you, Victor, about the scenario in which Donald Trump comes good on his promise of imposing 60% tariffs on certain Chinese goods. What options does China have when it comes to a response to that?
First of all these tariffs that Mr. Donald Trump wants to impose on the Chinese export to the United States are taxes on the American people. And eventually they will drive up inflation, eroding the living standards and the quality of life of the American people. And eventually it will be very destructive of the U.S. economic development in itself. I think I highly admire Donald Trump for taking positions that he will stick to peace rather than war in any part of the world. And if he really cares about peace, China-US peace should be the most important. That means whatever problems we need to solve them in peace, in diplomacy, in negotiations. So I'm actually very confident about the 4 years to come in terms of China and the United States dealing with each other as equal and getting onto the same page to solve the very complicated issues between our two countries. Let's keep our faith and let's hope for the best while prepared to deal with the worst.
Now, we have heard, of course, that Chinese electric vehicles really are a thorn in the side of the US auto market. Do you see a link at all between Donald Trump's threat on tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and also Elon Musk's firm support for Donald Trump?
First of all, I think the Biden administration has made the worst mistake in eliminating or banning anything Chinese for the EV car export, software, hardware, etc. It's total ban. Now, I remember Donald Trump mentioned that maybe there is a better way. That is to encourage the Chinese EV makers to set up plants in the United States together with the American companies to speed up the acceleration of the EV revolution in the United States, creating more high-quality jobs in the United States. I think that is the real choice. The real competition in EV cars, not between China and the United States. It is between the fuel car, which is the technology of the past, and EV car, which is the technology of today and tomorrow. So if the United States really want to achieve that major leap of faith in terms of making sure the automobile industry in the United States is sustainable, they need to choose to cooperate with China, because China has built up absolutely a leading advantage in EV car revolution. And if the United States wants to drag their feet, they are actually turning the automobile industry in the United States into another Kodak. That is not in the best interest of the American people, I'm afraid.
Mr. Giles, my last question to you, and I just want to ask you whether there is a perception in China that's widely held amongst not just the politicians, but the public as well, that the United States is determined to hold China back. Does that perception live on, do you think?
I think that perception, as you mentioned, is deeply entrenched because Biden has been saying that, Harris has been saying that, and Trump has been saying that, etc. I think from the Chinese perspective, we just need to refuse to be agitated. We need to maintain our own sanity and deal with the United States as it is, rather than losing our own composure. Because we're firmly convinced that better relations between China and the United States is not only possible, but it's inevitable. Both China and the United States need to deal with each other with respect and absolutely avoid any deterioration of the relations leading in the direction of confrontation or even war. And any problems between us, huge number of them, very serious problems, need to be dealt with in peace and full respect and diplomacy. That gives me the confidence that between China and the United States, we have the inevitability of peace. We need to embrace peace rather than agitating for war. And trade tariffs are not working. It's not going to serve the fundamental interests of the American people. And that is why I think China and the United States need to engage with each other as quickly as possible. And Donald Trump, in his capacity as the new president of the United States, need to be welcomed warmly in Beijing. The sooner, the better, rather than what Biden has done, refusing to visit China in his administration, which is such a disaster in itself.
It's been a pleasure having you on the show, Victor Gao, Vice President for the Centre for China and Globalisation. Thank you very much. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is preparing to assemble his senior leadership team in anticipation of his imminent return to the White House following Kamala Harris's public declaration of a commitment to a peaceful transfer of power.
Well, when he returns to the White House, the president-elect will be confronted with a series of international crises. The ongoing tensions with China that we were just talking about, as well as the protracted conflict between Russia and Ukraine. That's going to be another challenge to Trump's foreign policy stance, while the volatile situation in the Middle East, including ongoing clashes between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as the conflict between Hamas and Israel in Gaza, will also be critical areas of focus. Well, last month, our very own Washington bureau chief, Nadia Bilbassy Charters, sat down with Donald Trump to discuss some of these issues. Let's remind ourselves of what he told her.
So, you know, it's so sad to think that if I were president, that war would have never started. You wouldn't have all those dead people, all those, you know, just demolished cities and areas. You wouldn't have had October 7th. That's the most important. You wouldn't have had that. And all of the destruction and the hatred and everything else that followed October 7th. You wouldn't have had Russia attacking Ukraine. You wouldn't have had inflation, frankly, and you wouldn't have had the most embarrassing moment in the history of our country, in my opinion. So many people are reliant on the United States, and with me, they have somebody they can rely on. With Biden, he doesn't know he's alive.
And our colleague Nadia Bilbassy joins us now from Washington. Nadia, you interviewed Mr. Trump just a few weeks ago. What really stood out for you about him back then?
I'm in Florida. In fact, I'm still was covering the night of the election, and we're staying here till today. But the interview was very timely, and we, considering that we took it 2 weeks before the election day, and the president talked in depth about all these issues, was very important because he addresses really the concern for our viewers in the Middle East. He talked about he's against killing civilians. I asked him about Hamas in particular when he said that he gave them an ultimatum. They have to release U.S. hostages before he reached the White House. At the time, we didn't know if he was going to win the election or not. Now he is the president-elect. And I think sooner or later he will have a plan, a detailed plan of how he's going to tackle this issue and how he's going to call for some kind of maybe restriction on both whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas in terms of how he's going to move forward. I think he believes that there was an opportunity after the killing of both leaders, Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon and Sinwar in Gaza. And he believes that he should expand the Abraham Accord that he considered quite successful during his first term in power. So I think there is lots of things he can focus on. and Lebanon in particular, because he's been working very hard with the Lebanese American community. And I believe that Arab and Muslim Americans in Michigan might have delivered victory for him there.
Now, during his victory speech, Mr. Trump spoke about, that the promises made, promises kept, a slogan that he's made before. So when it comes to promises that he has made, what in particular will you be keeping an eye on with a view to him keeping by way of a promise?
I mean, if you're talking domestically, the first promise, he said that he will lead the biggest expulsion of illegal immigrants in the United States on day one, and I think he will work on that. He also promised that he will change the tax code. He will have an economic plan that will benefit the average American. As we have seen the results of the election, the red wave have swept the United States, and basically because the economy was number one for all voters in terms of concern, and they believe that he will deliver on that. So that's priority for him domestically. On the international scene, he promised to stop all conflicts and wars. To start with Ukraine, he believes he has a very good relationship, well, not necessarily very good, but he has a good relationship with President Putin. And he said to me that basically he can pick up the phone and talk to him to end the war. Now they were talking about perhaps that the Ukraine cannot join NATO for 20 years, maybe deploying some troops in no man's zone. There is people around him, and that's really crucial of who he will have as his closest advisors and how he will develop these plans. I think that will be a measure of success or failure. In the Middle East, I think now Jared Kushner is not going to play a role in this administration. He completely disappeared from the scene. We have seen another person. I don't know how much of influence he will have later on, but now, for the time being, in terms of Lebanon at least, Mr. Mas'ad Boulos, who is the father of his, the husband of his daughter Tiffany, and he has been active in the Arab and American and Muslim community, trying to basically rally on these points and saying the president promised that he will stop the war. And I was with him actually on that day, the day he gave us the interview. I was in Michigan. He met with the Muslim and Arab leaders, and he promised that he will stop the war. Now, will he stop it now before he reaches the White House, or he will work on it once he reaches? That's a question. Some people, I mean, and I think he told me that when I asked him, do you believe that the Prime Minister, the Israeli Prime Minister will hit Iran? And he said, well, maybe he has to do what he has to do. So we will see if he will allow Netanyahu to do more in the next 3 months, and he believes that he can impose a political settlement at the end, or he will stop him on day one. We don't know. Remind the viewers that the first phone call he got was from Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he's been doing lots of things for Israel, and he said that publicly on the campaign, including recognizing Jerusalem, moving the embassy, recognizing Israel legitimacy over the Golan Heights, despite the fact that this is against international law. And he did lots of things for them, in fact. So we will see how he's going to tackle the Middle East in details. When I asked him in the interview, he preferred to wait till he got elected, or if he wins this election, and he will tell us more of a detailed plan.
And when we are talking about foreign policy, in terms of that, how much does the average American really care?
Well, normally they don't. I have covered the election in the United States for 20 years. Foreign policy was never top priority for the American people, but because of the war in Gaza, because a new generation of Americans, we have seen it in college campuses, and especially among not just Arab and Muslim Americans, they're still a minority, but also among young in general, other minorities, African Americans, Asian Americans, especially for African Americans, they saw it as an equality and justice issue. The slogan was, you have to end the occupation. So it became a big issue in this election because of the war in Gaza and in Lebanon after that. And we have seen that basically, probably Georgia, where I visited just before the election, I realized it was 100,000 votes that was vital, Muslim and Arab Americans, and most of them said they will not vote for Kamala Harris because it's an extension of President Biden, and President Biden's policy was very, very unpopular in terms of how he tackled the conflict in Gaza, and he didn't call for a ceasefire. Of course, they were calling for arms embargo. We don't expect President Trump to do that. But at least it affected a few people in swing states that might have made a difference. And it shows, actually. Ukraine, to a lesser extent, there is an opposition within the Republican Party of sending millions of dollars for Ukraine, while an average American is struggling to make ends meet. They see it that maybe it's a time to revisit the U.S. policy towards Ukraine. But in general, I think for the first time ever, we have seen wars overseas affecting the life of, or the vote, rather, choice for Americans. I mean, mainly on the Democratic side and independent voters. But also when there is conflict in the Middle East or elsewhere in Ukraine or in Europe, it will affect also the gas prices. Yes. And this is vital for American voters.
Nadia Bilbassy there for us. Thank you so much. Pollsters in the 2024 election faced significant challenges in accurately forecasting outcomes, with many struggling to predict Donald Trump's performance, especially in key battleground states.
Although lessons were learned from the unexpected 2016 and 2020 results, several factors still affected accuracy. These included the difficulty in reaching and modelling Trump's base, the impact of last-minute undecided voters, and the possibility of shy Trump voters who are hesitant to disclose their support in the polls. Or shifts in voter behaviour, such as higher turnout amongst previously unrepresented groups, further complicated the polling landscape.
Well, CNN contributor Scott Jennings, who has become one of the network's most prominent pro-Trump voices, has called Trump's victory an indictment of the political information complex. Well, he argued that the stories portrayed by the media suggested that Vice President Harris was going to be far ahead in the polls.
I feel like this election, as we sit here and pour over this tonight, is something of an indictment of the political information complex. I mean, we've been sitting around here for the last couple of weeks, and the story that was portrayed was not true. I mean, we were told Puerto Rico was going to change the election. Liz Cheney, Nikki Haley voters, women lying to their husbands. Before that, it was Tim Walz and the camo hats. Night after night after night, we were told all these things and gimmicks were going to somehow push Harris over the line. And we were just ignoring the fundamentals. Inflation, people feeling like that they were barely able to tread water at best.
Okay, Scott Jennings speaking there on CNN. So, are the traditional polling methods still effective in capturing the complexities of modern electoral dynamics? Well, for more, we can speak now to Republican pollster BJ Martino, who is the president and CEO of the Tariffs Group. That's a political research and strategy firm. Great to have you back with us here on Al Arabiya News. When we spoke last week, you said you had your money on Trump, so you were right about that. You also said we might not have a clear result in the immediate aftermath of the election. So I'm assuming you were a little bit surprised that the result was both decisive and very quick to emerge.
Well, I think the concern about the timing was more about the counting of votes rather than the certainty of the outcome. Pennsylvania managed to start to count their votes pretty quickly and get those results in for us. North Carolina and Georgia were called soon. I spent the night in the state of Wisconsin, which it was 4:30 in the morning local time until finally the last tranche of votes came through, which secured Wisconsin and the presidency. So I think that the difference that we saw this year between the public and the private pollsters was significant. That is, those who are driven mostly by the media, paid for by the media, and are designed to create clicks and stories versus the private polling that is done for campaigns to make hard decisions. I would say, though, for looking at the overall numbers, when you look at the Real Clear Politics average of polls across the board in all the key states this year versus the ultimate outcome in the presidential, there was not a large delta, certainly not as large as it's been in some past years. Certainly there are some outliers, and some of those late CNN polls that came in Wisconsin and Michigan were clearly wrong. But the average of all the polls was only about a point and a half off in some of these states. But significantly, they were off a point and a half in Harris's favor, meaning that the polls showed a little bit better performance on average for Harris than the performance for Trump. And when you look at a state like Wisconsin or a state like Michigan, that the margin is so close, a small polling error like that can be determining the outcome one way or the other. But overall, the public polls taken together had a pretty clear view of where this was going. And the private polls certainly, as we talked last week, suggested it would be a good night for Trump.
And Trump clearly did better than many had expected. Were there any certain demographic groups there for you in where he particularly excelled?
Well, it was in many ways across the board, but I think a couple are very significant, particularly when you look at non-white voters. There were some African-American men in the exit polling, certainly Hispanic voters, which is going to be a long conversation, I think, particularly for the Democratic Party going forward. But I think the other story is the revenge of the middle class here. Voters in middle-class households, those who maybe don't have college degrees, those who were experiencing the economic after effects of high inflation, even though perhaps the rate of inflation had gone down, had not recovered economically, they were voting Republican this year. They had broken Republican more. The Democrats' performance was higher among those in upper income households and those with college and postgraduate degrees. But the middle class of America, who had suffered this economic devastation over the rate of inflation and problems with their economic outcome, were not buying the story from Biden and Harris that things were wonderful. They were being told that, oh, the jobs numbers are better, the inflation's come down. But voters in those middle class households recognize the economic reality for themselves and those around them and just didn't buy what the Democrats were selling.
I just want to pick up on what you were saying about the polls being so, well, wrong and giving Kamala Harris the consistent lead pretty much that we saw in so many of the polls. Who did that work against, do you think? Because on the one hand, you can see that Kamala Harris and her team had a sort of a slightly false sense of security. And on the other hand, Donald Trump and his team would have felt the need to fight all the harder for every single vote. What's your thinking?
Well, I think the Trump teams, I don't have any insight really fundamentally to either campaign's private polling, but you can see some of the actions that were taken publicly. First and foremost, the Harris campaign was giving up on North Carolina in the last week or so when they pulled millions of dollars off the air and moved them to other states late. They knew that state had gotten away from them. So that was some indication that things were breaking, that they had given up on a state and were moving to try and shore up what we call the blue wall, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. And when you look at the Trump campaign, they continued to press. Now, in terms of what impact does polling have on outcomes, the public polling, I think, doesn't have much of an impact on voters' decision-making or whether or not to come to the polls, whether or not they need to. Harris's lead in the public polling, again, it was only a minor difference, was not so vast that you would expect that Harris voters would say, I don't need to come out because we have this in the bag. It was still very close, and everyone had especially those three states, listed as toss-ups going late. There was no reason to think that the public polling miss, however small it was, had any impact on the behaviors of these voters.
And just very, very briefly, we're almost out of time. A little bit of methodology. Do you think that in the future we might see AI when it comes to elections?
Well, I think the incorporation of AI into the polling industry is something that everyone's taking a look at. One of the ways in which it's been most useful for pollsters is helping understand the unstructured data, all the open ends and the verbatims, and letting natural language come into the polling from voters and using the AI to process that. When it comes to modeling the electorate, there are already some ways in which AI is being deployed by some of the big data firms to help take all the collective polling data, the results, and use that to model out the larger electorate. I think that will continue, but I think we have to be careful that it always starts with the opinion of the voter. The last thing we want to do is leave up modeling and polling into a purely automated process, because we know, even with all the language models that we see, is that however those models are trained leads to biases. And if we don't have solid foundational data for voters, then the AI models aren't going to be any good. So we're never going to get away from talking to actual voters themselves and understanding their opinions.
Okay, pollster BJ Martino, President and CEO of the Tariffs Group. Thank you very much for speaking to us once again here on Arabiya News.
From commanding a crowd to coining a catchphrase, Donald Trump's speeches have become a huge part of his success, with memes and clips shared across the world.
I'm a better looking person than Kamala. I call her Laughing Kamala. You ever watch her laugh? She's crazy. She's not as crazy as Nancy Pelosi. You know who's further left than crazy, Bernie? Kamala. Kamala. She's a truly radical left lunatic. Kamala went full communist. You heard that? Kamala Harris, Kamala. You know why people don't like her? Nobody likes her. They said, women don't like Trump. I said, I think they do. And you know, Mexico is paying for the wall. It was all caused by crooked Joe Biden and the people that surround him. I will be retiring the name crooked from Hillary Clinton. This disgusting human being, Letitia Peekaboo James. We'll make America safe again. And we will make America great again.
Okay, President-elect Donald Trump there in some of his memorable moments. So how much of that is rehearsed? How much is improvised? Let's speak to someone who can tell us more. That is a professor and author of The Roots of Liberalism, Francis Buckley, who's a former speechwriter for Donald Trump. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Professor. First of all, what's it like writing a speech for Donald Trump?
Well, it's, first of all, those were speeches that Trump wrote. So as a speech writer, what you try to do is get inside the head of the candidate and provide a speech that he would agree with. And I tried to do that and was more or less successful. And but on a number of occasions, he edited what I said. So it's his speech in the end.
Given that, you wrote a 2016 foreign policy speech for Donald Trump that was delivered to AIPAC. Now, 8 years on, the world has changed considerably. What do you think his approach to the Middle East may be?
Well, I think the thing to realize about Trump is he sees himself as a deal maker, and that is to say that he's on the side of diplomacy rather than war. What happened to the Democratic Party was it really became, in recent years, the war party, right? They allied themselves to neocons, and that was a party which was repudiated by the American voters in 2006 over the second Iraq War. And they were repudiated again yesterday or 2 days ago. I mean, the instinct to diplomacy is largely absent in America. I mean, the American, many Americans kind of go-to hunches about foreign policy is send in the A-10 warthog. Trump, on the other hand, thinks that most of the problems can be solved, the world's problems can be solved by diplomacy. So expect to see a push towards diplomacy with respect to Ukraine, with respect to Gaza. Frankly, that's, vastly superior to, say, a George W. Bush idea of simply going to war, or the idea that we can't possibly have some kind of a compromise in Ukraine because that means that Putin will have won. No, I think that what's most needed in the world today is somebody with the instincts of diplomacy. And I think you'll have that with Trump.
Just going through that speech that you wrote, the 2016 AIPAC speech, I mean, I was struck by the usual presidential language. Just to quote from it, the bond between the US and Israel is absolutely, totally unbreakable. That's sort of typical. Then there's some language that I picked out, an expression, demented minds, to describe a decision by the Iranians. And then there was a, quote, horrible deal that was describing the Iran nuclear deal. And I was just wondering whether there was a conscious decision to break away from all that sort of classical presidential vocabulary. And do you think that's here now to stay?
Well, I think that it's very important to signal strong lines in the sand with respect to supporting Israel as against Iran, for example. But in other respects, all the elements for a deal are on the table, in particular with respect to Russia. One of the great tragedies of American foreign policy is that the left so demonized Trump over Russia falsely with their Russian collusion hoax that that kind of a deal wasn't possible. Well, expect it to happen now, and expect that to be the equivalent of a Nixon to China moment. Right? It'll mean a reversal of stasis in foreign policy. And I think that would extend to the Middle East as well, right? The one thing that's clear in all of this with respect to the Middle East is we can't go back to a Obama regime of making nice to Iran and sort of giving up on everything they're doing. Rather, I think that the effort will be to find common ground with people in the Arab world who are not necessarily fans of Iran, and in the process to stabilize relations between all of them and the state of Israel. That was the point of the Abrahamic Accords. That was a brilliant foreign policy triumph and was great for the entire region. I think that's the signal, that's the direction you could expect a Trump administration to go.
Mr. Trump, we've heard uses a lot of catchphrases, uses a lot of nicknames. I'm interested to know who actually comes up with these.
I'm sorry, say that again, please. I didn't catch you.
The nicknames, the catchphrases that the President Donald Trump uses, who actually comes up with these?
The phrases, well, they're authentically Trump. You can't, so you, as a speechwriter, don't put in that kind of language. But the thing about Trump, and all the clips that you had on your station just now, you might ask yourself, what has happened to Americans that they don't object to all of this? Well, what has happened to Americans is I think they rebel against the phoniness, the inauthenticity of a Democratic Party. Kamala Harris, for example, did a 180 on all of her policies. She was the most left-wing member of the Senate in 2019. She tried to pretend that that wasn't her and that the last 4 years didn't happen. As opposed to that inauthenticity, I think what Americans said is, look, we'd like somebody who's real. We'd like someone who we can believe in. And that was the image that Trump projected. So all of those, off-the-cuff statements by Trump were things where Americans said, oh, well, this is the real fellow, right? He's not a phony.
Sure. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump is proudly not PC. And I'm just wondering whether when you were writing speeches for him, you sometimes had to perhaps restrain him, or perhaps during a debrief, you'd say, perhaps avoid this kind of language, or perhaps no one's saying that these days. Were there ever situations like that?
No, I was the person who had to be restrained. In 2016, in speeches, I was certainly the person more than anyone else in favor of an accommodation with Russia. I thought that we might persuade Putin to abandon his thuggish behavior through a rapprochement. We thought that Putin was a thug, but that he was an intelligent thug with whom one could cut deals. I think that still is the thinking. And so I put down something to the effect in my draft that I could understand how, or we could understand how Putin might feel threatened by the expansion of NATO. And that was toned down by Trump. Trump ended up saying something to the effect that, I'm told we can't cut a deal with Putin. We're going to try to find out. So, no, on matters of policy, I think Trump had a better political sense than I did, obviously.
Just wondering, have you actually spoken to Donald Trump? Have you kept in contact with him or perhaps his son, Donald Jr.? And could you perhaps be someone who considers working with the new administration?
I am an academic. I have a full-time tenured position at a law school. I'm in addition to which I think I've aged out. So no, that's not going to happen. Yes, I have been in touch with people like Don Jr.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us and sharing all of that with us. Francis Buckley, former speechwriter for President Trump. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for joining us tonight. Coming up next is Riz Khan.
Indeed, and we will be back tomorrow at the very same time. And until then, thank you very much indeed for watching. Good night.
Good night.